Hey, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here today. This is the Energy Law Lecture Series. I'm Bill Keffer, Director of our Energy Law program here at the Law School. And as probably most of you know, we have this Energy Law Lecture Series we do throughout the fall semester and spring semester where we bring in guest speakers on topics that are, in the news at the moment, and this is no different today. Those of you who were with us last month will remember we had Jim Wright, who's current chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission. And we'll have one more this semester. It'll be in November, and that'll be Shane Walker, who is our director of the Texas Produced Water Consortium that's actually headquartered here at Texas Tech. So we'll be sending out, ads and promotional information for that one in November. So we'll have one more this semester. Our special guest today is coming to us all the way from Cleveland, Ohio. He is Charles Weller. He is associated with something called the CO2 Coalition, which I encourage you to look up on the internet if you haven't already. And he's going to be speaking on this topic of CO2 endangerment finding that is in the news again because the current administration is taking another look at a finding that EPA made several years ago regarding CO2. And so that's it's being talked about, written about quite a bit. And Mr. Weller's going to be talking about it with us today. So let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Weller. He is a lawyer. He's got over 50 years of legal experience, and his expertise spans various fields, including antitrust, labor, litigation, and health benefit law. His career includes positions at prominent firms such as Jones Day and Baker and Hostetler, as well as the Antitrust Division of the Ohio Attorney General's Office. He has represented major clients, including General Motors, Walmart, EDS, Newport News Shipbuilding, and the Cleveland Clinic. In addition to his legal work, Weller served in the Peace Corps as a physics and math teacher in Malaysia from 1966 to 1968. He's also the author of numerous publications and papers, including Problem-Solving Education for the New Global Knowledge Economy. He earned his bachelor's degree in mathematics from Yale University and his JD from Case Western Reserve University. That's a combination we don't see very often, right? Mathematics and law school. So hats off to you for that. Let me tell you a little bit about the CO2 Coalition, this organization that he represents here today. It was established in 2015 as a 501c3 organization for the purpose of educating thought leaders, policymakers, and the public about the important contribution made by carbon dioxide to our lives and the economy. The coalition seeks to engage in an informed and dispassionate discussion of climate change, humans' role in the climate system, the limitations of climate models, and the consequences of mandated reductions in CO2 emissions. I've gone on the website and looked at it for quite a while over the last couple of weeks in preparation for Mr. Weller's visit, and it's an impressive site. They've got something around 200 scientists, physicists, chemists, environmental scientists who are pictured. Their names are there, their titles are there, their credentials are provided. That sort of support for this organization called the CO2 Coalition. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it. There's also a handout, front and back, one-page handout that hopefully everybody has gotten. And I know Mr. Weller's going to be making reference to that. And the two authors, Richard Lindzen and William Happer, this is basically a representation of the comments that have been provided by the organization through these two authors to EPA regarding this endangerment finding. There's actually a full text link at the bottom of the first page, the front page, that I would encourage you to click on and read the longer playing version of their comment if you're interested in this topic. A couple of housekeeping items. Those of you who are in my Oil and Gas Law 1 course, remember to come down front and sign the attendance sheet down front where I'm sitting, because anything else that's out front in the lobby to sign, that's not me. So if you want credit for being here, come down and sign this attendance sheet where I am. And those of you who are joining us by Zoom, thanks for being with us. The course number for CLE credit will be provided by QR code at the end of Mr. Weller's remarks. The title of Mr. Weller's remarks today is Scientific and Legal Issues on Repealing the Endangerment Finding and More. This is a great opportunity for you guys to learn about this topic, and we got a great guy here to talk to us about it, so please help me welcome Charles Weller.
Excuse me. Thank you so much for being here. It's a really great pleasure for me here because I had many fun times in Texas. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and northern, but after the Peace Corps, I worked for the Peace Corps recruiting people. And one of our great places we spent a lot of time recruiting people was in Texas, and including people at Texas Tech. So it's a personal thing to be really nice to be back here again. And he mentioned that I was a Peace Corps volunteer. Just let me tell you a quick story about what I was doing and why. So I was a physics teacher just north of Singapore. And what the Malaysian government had decided to do was the average income in 1966 of a Malaysian was $400 a year annually. And so the Malaysian government said, we got to stop this. We got to get people out of poverty. And so they provided mass education focused on people getting jobs. And there were 100 Peace Corps volunteers like me that came to Malaysia. And we played a small role, but I'm proud to say the Malaysian average income has dramatically increased since because of the Malaysian government's focus on getting people good jobs. So that's the background. My talk today is about a paper that Richard Lindzen of MIT and Will Happer of Princeton submitted comments on the EPA's proposal to repeal the endangerment finding. So my comment is I'm sort of summarizing some of the highlights of that paper. And they do this, their comment is organized in a way I've never seen before. And what they do is start with fundamentals, which is what is science and what is not science. And the good news for those of you who didn't major in science or engineering or mathematics is this. Coming to law school, no matter what your background in science is or was, coming to law school, one of the most important things you learn is legal method, to think like a lawyer. Well, guess what? The basic method of legal method is the same as scientific method. And what that is the interaction of theory with facts. And facts always trump theories. So in law, for example, when you read a case, you know, what do? You look for the facts that the court cites as the basis for its legal conclusion. That's never been discussed before, but the neat thing is just going to law school, no matter what your background, you learn the most important thing in science, which is scientific method, which equals legal method. So what is not science? Well, it's the same thing that you find out when you do legal analysis. So is 97% of scientists' opinions science? Is the consensus science? Is peer-reviewed science, articles science? Is government opinion science? No, none of that is science. Scientific knowledge is determined by scientific method. And it's basically just like law. When you do a legal analysis, you may be looking at 97% of what law professors think the Supreme Court should have done, or the consensus of what these law professors say, or law review articles, or government opinions saying that the law should be X. Guess what? all the time the Supreme Court is going to decide what the law is, none of the other stuff. Similarly, so it's just like legal method and scientific method are the same. Scientific method controls Supreme Court, and legislation controls what is law. Similarly, if what they do in a lot of climate science is they cherry pick the facts or they fabricate the facts. So in science, that's just a total violation of scientific method. And guess what? When you do a legal analysis, you can't just focus on the good facts. You have to address the bad facts. That's what you do as a lawyer. You've got to figure out how to deal with bad facts and bad law. The paper that Dick Lindzen and Will Happer submitted is basically in two parts. It deals with unscientific sources like scientific, including the 97% of science of opinion or peer-reviewed articles or articles, theoretical models that don't work. That's one part of the comment paper. And they have 5 examples of bad science where they've cited as a basis for the endangerment finding unscientific sources. 5 sources, so the paper covers 5. And then the second type they cover, which you'll see in part 3 of the paper, where they don't consider bad science, science that contradicts the idea that carbon dioxide and fossil fuels cause dangerous warming. And in law, as in science, you can't ignore bad facts or bad law. Again, part of your analysis is to consider and analyze bad facts and so on, and bad law. So that's part 3 of the paper, and they gave 6 examples where the EPA totally ignored all the contradictory science against the idea that carbon dioxide and fossil fuels cause dangerous warming. So I'm going to focus on 2 of the 11 examples that was in the paper. And also, FYI, part 2 of the paper goes through what is and is not science in more detail. So the first example of science they totally ignore, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by ignoring bad science or bad law, which is if you were a lawyer and your client wanted to fix prices with another competitor, and you just ignored the law, that's a criminal antitrust violation to fix prices with your competitor. And you'd never, as a lawyer, tell your client, no, we can just ignore the price fixing law. That would be totally unacceptable in law, but it's totally unacceptable in science. So what's my first example of how the EPA, when they wrote their endangerment finding, what science did they totally ignore? I think the most stunning example is the physics of CO2. It turns out that CO2 does indeed have properties of warming the climate. But it turned out, as a matter of physics, that CO2 loses its ability to do any warming very quickly. It's just a matter of physics that as the amount of carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, CO2 loses its ability to warm the planet. So let's see, I'm not going through my slide very well. That's right. So here we are. How quickly does it lose its ability to do any kind of warming that's significant? The physics of CO2 have been well known for a long time, which it dramatically loses its ability to warm the plant. And so you can see in this chart how quickly CO2 loses its ability to warm the plant. You see on the bottom the amount of carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere. And so, yeah, at 100 parts per million in the atmosphere, CO2 is pretty powerful and its ability to warm the plant. But that quickly drops off. And so it turns out that the physics of CO2 is that in 1750, as you may know, that's the date all the climate alarmists like to cite, the beginning of the industrial age when fossil fuels started emitting CO2, the climate. They say from 1750 on, it's the industrial age and the emission of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels that cause extraordinary warming and creates the great danger in the future of warming unless we stop fossil fuels from eliminating or disseminating, emitting carbon dioxide, unless we get carbon dioxide emissions down to net zero by 2050. The scientific fact, the physics of CO2 is exactly the opposite. It doesn't matter how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere from 1750 onward, because it's already lost its ability to warm the planet. Guess what? That's nowhere discussed in the endangerment finding, and it's nowhere discussed, for example, in the National Academy of Sciences, just this 150-page report claiming that it's really important that the endangerment findings stay in place. Nowhere do they mention the science that totally contradicts them. So it's a matter of physics. At the level of 280 parts per million in 1750 and higher to today, like it's 420 parts per million, or you can double it, carbon dioxide has a trivial effect on temperature. It will cause no harm to the environment, to the infrastructure, or cause any damage at all. You can emit carbon dioxide and use fossil fuels to much more than today without any effect. The other nice thing about carbon dioxide is, how many of you know that carbon dioxide, the more you have, the better crops grow, the better plants grow? Is that something many of you know? Right? I mean, the basic thing about carbon dioxide is that it's essential to life, that it is the source of plant food and other greenery. And the more you have of CO2, the better. Again, the physics of CO2 is such that it proves that if you doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what would be the effect? You'd increase the world's food supply by 40%. And what would be the effect on the temperature? Virtually nothing. Trivial effect on temperature. So, from a scientific point of view, the endangerment finding, just ignoring this one particular aspect of science, how the physics of CO2 works, is a scientific basis for saying the endangerment finding is scientifically invalid. And for that reason alone, it should be repealed. So that's one of the 11 parts of their paper. that I'm going to focus on. The second part has to do with, here, let me hit the right button. All the evidence, so-called scientific evidence that the endangerment finding cites is unscientific. None of it has any scientific value. And my favorite example, again, totally contrary to what most people hear, is that the International Panel of Climate Change is often said to be the best source of science in climate area. Now, is that, how many people have that perception? The International Panel on Climate Change is the cutting edge of science in this field. Does that ring any bells with anybody? It turns out when you look at the International Panel by its name, it tells you it's an international panel of governments, not of scientists. And so, contrary to what is often told of us about the international panel, it has, what it produces has no scientific value at all. And let me detail why that's the case, which again, it goes into much more detail in Dick and Will's paper, which is that the rules of the International Panel on Climate Change say that the summary for policymakers, and I assume many of you have seen or heard a reference to the summary for policymakers. Is that something people here have seen or know what I'm talking about? Well, anyway, it's they do this about every 5 years, and the summary is about a 50-page document, and the underlying reports are like 1,000 pages. But the rules specifically of the International Panel on Climate Change say that the summary cannot be issued until there's, quote, line-by-line review and approval by the 195 governments that make up the International on Climate Change. This next slide shows you what really happens. So when they're drafting the summary for policymakers, they all, 195 governments, sit there, and you see in this picture, these are not scientists that sit around writing the summary for policymakers. It's representatives of the government. And so as a basic matter of science, governments never, ever are allowed to determine science. It's the scientific method that determines science. And just as an example, to drive the point home, Will Happer, this professor of physics that co-authored the comment, wrote extensively about what happened in Russia when Stalin appointed a guy named Lysenko as the head of agriculture in Russia. And Lysenko's attitude was, I have a view of agriculture, and the conventional view of agriculture is wrong. My idea is wrong, is right, theirs is wrong. And he suppressed all the scientists that said, no, if you want to grow more crops, you've got to use existing knowledge about agriculture. And Lysenko said, no, they've got to use my science, and Stalin backed him up. Guess what? The result was agricultural crops in Russia deteriorated dramatically. And millions of people in Russia died because this scientist that was controlling the agricultural science in Russia, appointed by the government, was dead wrong, literally and figuratively. So that's why the IPCC, when its rules require that the summary of policymakers, which control what is written in the longer reports, must be determined not by science, but by scientists is of no scientific value. You're not going to hear that anywhere. You're going to hear that IPCC is a great source and must be considered. But for that reason alone, the extensive use in the endangerment finding, the 2009 endangerment finding by the EPA, is scientifically invalid because it's the biggest source cited in the endangerment finding. I think I counted more than 400 citations to International Panel of Climate Science as a scientific basis for the endangerment finding. If you take that all away alone, which you should do because it's not science, for that reason alone, the endangerment finding should be repealed. So what's the conclusion of all this? So the conclusion is these two great physicists, and these are internationally renowned physicists, Lindzen from MIT, Happer from Princeton, is the endangerment finding is fatally flawed science for 11 reasons, 2 of which I've covered. They ignored the physics of CO2 that at this level today, and indeed starting in 1750 at 280 parts per million, it was already wimpy. It was unable to cause any significant warming. And secondly, the other reason covered in their paper is all the scientific sources like the IPCC have no value as science. In fact, the real science of carbon dioxide and fossil fuels is that increasing CO2 emissions and increasing the use of fossil fuels will actually benefit people worldwide in 2 ways. It provides more food and cheap energy. So, what does this all mean? And again, these are practicing physicists. That's what they do in their departments at the great universities. But they say the problem of demonizing carbon dioxide and fossil fuels is disastrous for people worldwide and for the West. And that's why I love the quote that's in the paper that Bill mentioned earlier, that their comment on the endangerment finding. In their words, they say, the endangerment finding and policies related on the theory that carbon dioxide and fossil fuels will cause dangerous climate warming and extreme weather. They say it will, and I'm quoting, destroy Western economies, impoverish the working class, condemn billions of the world's poorest to continued poverty and increased starvation, have our children despairing over the alleged absence of a future, and enrich the enemies of the West who are enjoying the spectacle of our suicide, what they call the suicide march. So that's my basic presentation. Obviously, I'm only half an hour in, and I look forward to your questions and thoughts.
Hey, Chuck, I'll start because I imagine there are folks if they can get over their shyness, would like to ask you some questions, but I'll start with just commenting that this probably is a news flash to everybody that no one has ever really seen in major media coverage or in any of the government publications or presentations about CO2. Obviously, it is 180 degrees opposed to what we've been hearing for the last many years about the dangers of CO2 and the EPA's finding that CO2 is contributing to significant warming in the world. So what is your thought, or what do you think Linzer, Happer, or the other CO2 coalition folks think is the explanation for such a significant thesis having been suppressed all this time, and how have they been responded to by their colleagues who hold different opinions?
Well, it's a really important question because, as you know, that I don't know is for most people, and including myself, when I first started looking at this field, I thought what you read every day: carbon dioxide and fossil fuels are causing this incredible danger to the planet. And so what got me involved in the field was that Will Happer wrote an article in Wall Street Journal that said this is a scientific fraud. And because I was a physics teacher at one time, the fact that a physics professor from Princeton would write that, that's why I started looking. And the more I looked at it, into it, the more I was convinced that Happer is right. But the question that Bill asked of what the heck, why is this never reported? So part of their paper explains what they call the climate dogma protocol. And what has happened, and I have very serious why this happened, basically I think it was money. The media never reports this contrary science. Believe it or not, all the big science journals never publish contrary science. And I'll give you one of the things you'll see in the paper. Dick Lindzen talks about how he published in a very important scientific journal an article that talked about this climate science fraud. And the result of this journal publishing Dick Lindzen's article, the editor was fired. And secondly, when the new guy came in, and there were many articles writing that Dick was wrong, Dick said, well, can I respond in your journal to these articles that criticize what I've written? The journal would not let him contradict or reply. So, the journals, the science, really all the top science journals, they don't publish. Will Happer's work, Lindzen's work, a guy named Steve Koonin work, Steve, by background, I don't know if you know Steve, but Steve was actually worked for the Obama administration, and he published, I think in 2014, an article called Unsettled. And if you really want to see more details about the science, you read Steve's article or book. For example, he spends 80 pages showing the science of CO2 and extreme weather, floods, sea level rise, wildfires. 80 pages he shows is scientifically false. The journals don't publish it. The media doesn't publish it. Any contradictory science. A lot of the scientists, for example, Will told me at Princeton, and the same thing is true of MIT, a lot of, if you want to publish in the field of climate science, you can only get money and tenure if you publish articles saying carbon dioxide and fossil fuels cause dangerous climate warming. Why? 30% are roughly in that area of universities' revenue comes from the government and private foundations that will only support those universities and only send them money if they publish articles supporting the scientific fraud of climate science, of carbon dioxide and fossil fuels. So you have the universities and then politicians. It just so happens that a lot of politicians are also paid to advocate carbon dioxide and fossil fuel will cause a catastrophe. Now, where this money comes from is a whole different subject. But anyway, you put them all together. That's why they call it the climate dogma protocol. There are all these agencies, media, scientific journals, universities are basically paid to only present one side of the picture. So that's one of the really big problems. And the neat thing is that, again, with the change of administrations and from a legal point from the Supreme Court, if we get the real science in front of the current Supreme Court, our theory is when they see the science, the real science, they have the ability to strike down the endangerment findings, and we think they will. So that's a long answer, Bill, to your question. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes, sir, ma'am. Sir.
Thank you so much for your time today being here at Texas Tech Law School. We sure do appreciate you. I know that there are a lot of folks in the audience that are not necessarily, energy law experts quite yet, right? And some 1Ls or 2Ls that maybe have not taken energy law classes. So to kind of help contextualize what you're talking about specifically, could you give some examples of what exactly in people's day-to-day lives would change? Will diesel trucks, have emissions on them, or what does this practically change in our day-to-day society?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it goes to what Dick and Will said at the end about how dangerous this is for the West and the United States. And so the Biden administration issued over 100 regulations that will do everything from eliminate gas stoves, gas furnaces, gas water heaters. These regulations, if they stand, will mean that you cannot buy a gas furnace, gas heater, and gas water heater. Regulations that they issued would eliminate the gas cars. You could no longer buy a gas car because the automobile companies cannot produce gas cars that meet these regulations. And so think about what that means. Just in the automobile industry, about 10 million people have jobs in the automobile industry or related industries. So that would mean you'd eliminate 10 million people's jobs with these existing regulations unless they're overturned. And that means not only 10 million people would be unemployed, but all of the taxes that come from selling cars. So the governments would be severely impacted if these regulations that the Biden administration issued are allowed to stand. And again, I mentioned there are 100 regulations, all based really on the endangerment finding. All these regulations would have an enormous bad effect on everyday working lives, whether it's employment, your ability to choose a gas car and having to buy an electric car instead. These existing Biden regulations based on the endangerment findings would have that kind of direct effect on each one of you. Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry. So I guess the next question intuitively would be, which regulations do you think specifically would have the largest impact, and which ones can we piece out first? Because we've kind of got to triage it in terms of reducing the economic impact or the detrimental economic impact, I would say.
So again, of the 100 regulations, my favorite's the one I mentioned. There are 2 or 3 regulations that deal with eliminating gas cars. And as you may know, a number of states have adopted laws that would say you can't buy a gas car in California in 10 years. So I think that's my single biggest one. But you think about you think of the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy has 100 regulations. I just mentioned a few of them: gas stoves, gas furnaces, gas water heaters. But there are 100 more the Department of Energy has issued. Go to their website and they'll tell you what they are. It's really hard to believe how many regulations the Biden administration adopted that have this kind of detrimental effect. Yes.
Do you think rescission of this rule will tank the ESG-based carbon credit market that a lot of big companies have to, or at least are being socialized to comply with?
I guess I didn't. Could you restate the question? I didn't.
Yeah, well, rescission of this rule basically get rid of the carbon credit market system.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. Is another part of this is a carbon credit rules, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It will eliminate the need for carbon credits, because guess what? CO2. If you create more CO2, that's good for the world and it's good for people worldwide. So the idea of giving a carbon credit goes away completely. You're exactly right. That's a really important point, because isn't that a part of Tesla's success is they get paid with carbon credits, if I understand that correctly. I don't know, does anybody really know, but if you look at Tesla's revenue, a significant part, is my understanding, comes from carbon credits. Companies buying carbon credits. So, any more questions?
Let me follow up on that question, because
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. That I'd be interested to hear what you think, or what your organization thinks you'll have to overcome in the way of additional opposition. Because on the one hand, you've got the problem that you have defined in terms of why this seemingly, very significant, obvious scientific point has been sort of pushed to the side. But now we've sort of been doing this long enough where we've created these artificial markets. We've got carbon credit markets. We've now got, carbon CO2 sequestration and storage that is part of the tax code, and a lot of companies have been investing a lot of money on the premise that that's going to be available to them. So now you've got sort of the additional opposition of folks who have a lot of money at stake. So how does your organization anticipate overcoming that opposition?
Well, again, as a lawyer, I focus on what we can do as lawyers, and so that's why I'm working with Will and Dick and Steve Koonin to get to the Supreme Court. The idea that this is all based on a scientific fraud, because the Supreme Court has the ability to strike that all down. And I think the other practical legal aspect is we now have 6 members of the Supreme Court, and I would hope other members of the Supreme Court, when they see the real science that's been hidden, they would also agree to strike this all down. So again, the fact that the Supreme Court has the authority and the power to overturn all these rules is really why we're focused on them. But I think we also have to be active in letting the rest of the world, public, know, wait a minute, it's a matter of basic science. CO2 and fossil fuels are great for us. We need to tell that story, yeah.
To that point regarding your organization's intent to bring this to the Supreme Court, I'm interested in hearing more about the legal mechanism that you intend on using to bring that kind of a case.
So the legal mechanism in a couple parts. This endangerment finding, when they issue the rule that repeals it, will be litigated the next day, by all sorts of organizations that say we ought to keep the endangerment finding. So that, for sure, the repealing the endangerment finding will end up in the Supreme Court. That's one way. Another way is there are about 30 cases in state court that argue that the fossil fuel companies have caused trillions of dollars of damages to Texas, Vermont, California, New York by emitting carbon dioxide as a result of burning fossil fuels, and emitting carbon dioxide raises temperatures and causes all the extreme weather that has hurt our state's roads and actually affects the health. That's all a scientific problem. Those are cases that are pending. So one of the things I'm hoping will happen is some of the fossil fuel companies will learn this new science and start using that as a defense of those cases. So that's potentially 30 cases. There are other, New York and Vermont have laws, they call them climate superfund laws. The way they work is they say, okay, if you, as a fossil fuel company, sold gasoline and other fossil fuels in our state, you caused that harm and you owe us, as a matter of strict liability, a portion of the damages you caused. The Department of Justice has filed lawsuits against both the New York and Vermont law, and like 20 Republican attorneys general also have cases against the New York and Vermont law. And so they don't know the science. So our hope is what we're doing as a coalition is trying to get the science in front of these plaintiffs so they would use it. And those are in federal court, which would also end up in the Supreme Court. So again, when the science is presented to the Supreme Court that they have never heard before, like everybody else, I am convinced they will strike it all down. And one of the things I will mention about the neat thing about the Supreme Court is, you may know, in 1993, the Supreme Court said, well, there's too much junk science in trial courts. And so they adopted in the Daubert case and 3 other cases the rule that no, before an expert testifies on something, the trial judge must decide whether they are reliably talking about science. And it's now codified in Federal Rule of Evidence 702. And when you look at Rule 702, none of the science supporting climate warming danger would pass 702. One, because 702 says you must have a sufficient amount of data. And what they do so often in climate science is they cherry pick the data, and sometimes even fabricate the data. You'll see in the paper that Dick and Will put together, the National Climate Assessment, which is done like every 5 years. These guys totally fabricated the data to try to show there's a great danger of wildfires. And the paper details, I mean, really blatant fabrication by the National Climate Assessment people. So that's why I think the Supreme Court is attuned to looking at what real science is and is not.
All right. Well, this is great. Thanks for being with us, Chuck. Let's give Charles Weller a big round of applause.